How did Europe become so powerful? The hidden story behind the rise of the West. Every day, billions of people use inventions, institutions, and ideas that trace their origins to Europe. We travel on roads inspired by Roman engineering. We study in universities whose traditions stretch back nearly 1,000 years. We live under legal systems shaped over centuries, use technologies powered by scientific discoveries, and participate in a global economy influenced by European trade and industry. But how did one relatively small corner of the world become so influential? Was it geography, religion, war, innovation? Or was it something far more complex? To answer that question, we must travel back nearly 2,000 years and uncover one of history's greatest mysteries, the rise of the West. The story begins not with triumph, but with collapse. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire, fragmented under the pressure of invasions, internal conflict, and political instability. Great cities declined, long-distance trade weakened, and the imperial government that had once connected much of Western Europe disappeared. Yet civilization itself did not end. Farmers continued to cultivate the land, craftsmen continued their work, churches remained centers of community, and new kingdoms slowly emerged from Rome's ruins. What vanished was not society, but a single system of political authority. For generations, Rome had provided roads, laws, taxation, security, and administration across much of Europe. When that system collapsed, power shifted to local rulers, bishops, nobles, and emerging kingdoms. At first glance, this seemed like decline. Compared with Rome's vast cities and monumental architecture, early medieval Europe appeared poor and fragmented. Yet that fragmentation would become one of Europe's greatest long-term advantages. Unlike many large empires governed from a single center, medieval Europe was divided into dozens of competing kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and principalities. Rulers constantly sought military, economic, and political advantages over one another. New farming techniques, stronger fortifications, better financial systems, and improved administration spread because neighboring states quickly copied successful ideas. Competition often brought devastating wars, but it also encouraged constant adaptation. Europe, however, was never isolated. While Western kingdoms rebuilt, the Byzantine Empire preserved much of Rome's Eastern legacy, and the Islamic world entered a remarkable age of scientific, mathematical, and commercial achievement. Through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, Europe absorbed knowledge from many civilizations. Indian numerals arrived largely through the Islamic world. Classical Greek works returned through Arabic translations and Byzantine manuscripts. Navigation, medicine, astronomy, and engineering all benefited from ideas that had traveled across continents. The rise of the West was never the story of one civilization working alone. It was built through centuries of exchange, borrowing, competition, and adaptation. Yet before Europe could build universities, launch global voyages, or spark an industrial revolution, it faced a far simpler challenge. It had to feed more people. Much of northern Europe was covered by dense forests and heavy clay soil that was difficult to cultivate. Gradually, new agricultural techniques transformed the landscape. The heavy moldboard plow opened fertile ground that had previously resisted farming. Improved horse collars and horseshoes made animal power more efficient, while the three-field system increased harvests by allowing farmland to recover without remaining unused for long periods. Watermills and windmills reduced labor, freeing people for other work. The effects reached far beyond agriculture. Larger harvests supported growing populations. Villages expanded into towns, and towns became centers of trade and craftsmanship. As fewer people were needed to produce food, others specialized as blacksmiths, masons, carpenters, merchants, shipbuilders, and weavers. Europe's future prosperity rested on a simple truth. Every city, university, army, and workshop depended on farmers producing enough food to support them. By the 11th and 12th centuries, many parts of Europe were changing rapidly. Forests gave way to farmland, new settlements appeared, and busy markets connected distant regions. Merchants exchanged wool, grain, timber, salt, wine, and imported goods, while craftsmen developed increasingly specialized skills. Guilds regulated trades, preserving knowledge from one generation to the next and maintaining standards that strengthened local economies. Trade also transformed the continent. Italian city-states linked Europe with Mediterranean commerce, while northern ports connected markets across the Baltic and North Seas. Merchants developed systems of credit, contracts, insurance, and banking that allowed wealth to move more efficiently across long distances. These financial innovations were not uniquely European. They evolved through centuries of interaction with Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Mediterranean trading traditions, but they became essential foundations for Europe's expanding economy. Another unusual feature of Europe was its political diversity. Because no single ruler dominated the continent for long, scholars, merchants, and skilled craftsmen often found opportunities by moving across borders. A thinker rejected in one kingdom might flourish in another. A successful military innovation or financial system rarely remained confined to one state for long. Rival powers quickly copied anything that gave their neighbors an advantage. Knowledge spread in other ways as well. Monasteries carefully preserved manuscripts that might otherwise have disappeared, while cathedral schools gradually evolved into Europe's first universities. Institutions such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford became centers where theology, law, philosophy, medicine, and natural science were debated. Students traveled across borders, united by the common language of Latin, allowing ideas to circulate more freely than ever before. Europe was still far from becoming the world's dominant region. China remained technologically sophisticated, India was one of the richest manufacturing centers on earth, and the Islamic world continued to lead in many fields of scholarship and commerce. Nothing about Europe's future success was inevitable. Then, in the middle of the 15th century, a new invention dramatically accelerated the spread of knowledge. It was the printing press. The printing press did far more than make books cheaper. It changed how quickly knowledge could spread. Printing had existed in East Asia for centuries, and movable type was developed there long before Europe adopted it. But in the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg and other European printers combined movable metal type, oil-based ink, and mechanical presses into a system that transformed communication. A manuscript that once took months to copy by hand could now be reproduced hundreds of times in a matter of days. For the first time, ideas could travel faster than the people who created them. Books became more affordable. Literacy gradually expanded. Scholars could study identical texts instead of relying on handwritten copies filled with errors. Governments published laws more efficiently. Merchants printed commercial manuals, and universities gained faster access to new discoveries. The printing press did not guarantee truth. It also spread propaganda, rumors, and religious conflict, but it fundamentally changed the speed at which Europe could learn. That transformation became clear in 1517 when Martin Luther challenged the sale of indulgences and other practices within the Catholic Church. Religious criticism had existed before, but printing allowed his arguments to spread across Europe with unprecedented speed. The Protestant Reformation divided Western Christianity, leading to decades of conflict while encouraging greater literacy, stronger administrations, and expanding education as rival churches sought to teach and defend their beliefs. At the same time, another revolution was quietly unfolding. A growing number of scholars believed that the natural world should not simply be accepted through ancient authority, but investigated through observation, measurement, and experiment. Nicolaus Copernicus argued that Earth revolved around the Sun. Johannes Kepler demonstrated that planets moved in elliptical orbits. Galileo Galilei's telescopes revealed moons orbiting Jupiter and mountains on the moon, while Isaac Newton later united mathematics, astronomy, and physics into a powerful explanation of gravity and motion. These discoveries did not appear in isolation. They depended upon universities, skilled instrument makers, printers, merchants, and governments willing to support research. Europe's political divisions once again played an unexpected role. A scientist rejected in one kingdom could often continue working in another. No single authority controlled every university, printing press, or scientific society across the continent. Knowledge itself became competitive. Governments soon realized that scientific discoveries could improve navigation, mining, engineering, medicine, agriculture, and warfare. Curiosity and power increasingly reinforced one another. Yet Europe still occupied the western edge of global trade. The richest commercial networks stretched across Asia, Africa, and the Indian Ocean, where merchants had exchanged goods for centuries. European kingdoms wanted direct access to spices, silk, porcelain, and other valuable products, encouraging a new era of maritime exploration. Portugal led the way. Sailors gradually mapped the western coast of Africa before Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea, opening a direct maritime route into the Indian Ocean. These voyages relied heavily on knowledge accumulated across many civilizations, including navigation, astronomy, mathematics, cartography, and shipbuilding traditions developed throughout Africa, the Islamic world, and Asia. Europe entered an already connected trading system. It did not create one. Meanwhile, Spain looked west. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean while searching for a western route to Asia, beginning sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. For indigenous peoples, this marked the beginning of one of history's most devastating transformations. Disease spread faster than conquest, destroying communities that had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and other infections. European expansion brought new trade, migration, and exchange, but also conquest, displacement, and immense human suffering. The Atlantic slave trade became one of the darkest foundations of Europe's growing economy. Millions of Africans were captured, transported across the ocean under horrific conditions, and forced into slavery on plantations and in mines. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities generated enormous wealth for merchants, investors, governments, and ports across Europe. Any honest explanation of Europe's rise must acknowledge this reality. Innovation, education, and entrepreneurship played essential roles, but so too did colonial expansion, resource extraction, and systems of exploitation that enriched European states while devastating millions of lives elsewhere. As overseas trade expanded, European governments required better ways to finance exploration, commerce, and increasingly expensive wars. Banking became more sophisticated. Insurance reduced commercial risk. Stock exchanges attracted investors willing to finance distant voyages. Chartered companies, backed by both private capital and state power, established trading networks that stretched across continents. The Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company were more than commercial businesses. They signed treaties, maintained armies, built forts, and governed territories, blending trade with political power on an unprecedented scale. By the 18th century, Europe had become one of the world's most dynamic commercial regions, but it was still not the richest. China, Mughal India, and the Ottoman Empire remained formidable economic powers. Then, in Britain, a transformation began that would permanently alter the balance of global history. Machines started doing work that had always depended on human hands. The Industrial Revolution had begun. The Industrial Revolution did not happen because Europe suddenly became more intelligent than the rest of the world. It emerged from centuries of gradual change. Britain possessed growing financial markets, expanding trade networks, abundant coal, improving agriculture, political institutions that protected investment, and a culture in which inventors, engineers, and entrepreneurs could often turn new ideas into profitable businesses. Those conditions came together at a remarkable moment in history. The first breakthroughs transformed the textile industry. Machines that spun thread and wove cloth dramatically increased production while reducing the cost of manufacturing. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine allowed factories to operate with far greater efficiency, no longer relying entirely on rivers for power. Before long, steam engines drove pumps in mines, powered mills, propelled locomotives, and carried ships across oceans. For the first time, economic growth became increasingly driven by machines rather than by human or animal muscle. Cities expanded rapidly as millions left the countryside in search of work. Railways connected regions that had once been separated by days of travel. Ironworks, steel mills, and factories reshaped the landscape, while telegraph lines allowed information to travel almost instantly across vast distances. What had taken weeks could now happen in minutes. Industrialization transformed daily life, but it came at a cost. Factory workers often endured exhausting hours in dangerous conditions. Children labored in mines and mills. Entire families crowded into polluted industrial cities where disease spread quickly and housing struggled to keep pace with rapid population growth. Rivers became contaminated, skies darkened with coal smoke, and wealth was distributed unevenly. The same revolution that produced unprecedented prosperity also created deep social inequality. Public pressure gradually forced governments to respond. Child labor laws, factory inspections, public sanitation projects, compulsory education, and expanding political representation slowly improved living conditions. These reforms were rarely given freely. They were won through decades of activism, debate, journalism, and political struggle. By the 19th century, industrial power had fundamentally changed the balance of global influence. European nations and later the United States, which industrialized rapidly using many European technologies and institutions, could manufacture goods on a scale previously unimaginable. Steam-powered navies projected military power across oceans, while railways connected colonies to ports that exported raw materials and imported manufactured products. Advances in medicine, engineering, communications, and transportation strengthened these expanding networks. Colonial empires reached their greatest extent during this period. European governments controlled territories across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, often claiming they were bringing civilization or progress. In reality, colonial rule took many forms. Some regions experienced new infrastructure, railways, schools, or administrative systems, while many others suffered dispossession, forced labor, economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and violent conquest. The wealth generated by empire undoubtedly contributed to Europe's economic development, but it was only one part of a much larger picture. Industrial technology, scientific innovation, financial institutions, education, political competition, and centuries of accumulated knowledge all interacted to produce Europe's extraordinary expansion. History rarely has a single cause. By the beginning of the 20th century, Europe stood at the center of global finance, science, manufacturing, and imperial power. Many believed its dominance would continue indefinitely. Instead, the continent turned its immense industrial capacity against itself. In 1914, the First World War erupted after decades of political rivalry, militarization, and competing alliances. Industrial technology transformed warfare into destruction on a scale the world had never witnessed. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, submarines, tanks, and aircraft claimed millions of lives. Entire generations were shaped by the conflict, while Europe's economies and political systems emerged deeply scarred. Barely 2 decades later, an even greater catastrophe followed. The Second World War engulfed much of the globe, bringing unprecedented devastation. Cities were destroyed by aerial bombardment. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians died. The Holocaust exposed the horrifying consequences of racist ideology and state-sponsored genocide, reminding the world that scientific and industrial progress alone does not guarantee moral progress. When the war ended in 1945, Europe faced a choice. Rather than allowing centuries of rivalry to continue, many leaders sought a different path. American assistance through the Marshall Plan helped rebuild shattered economies, while new institutions encouraged cooperation instead of repeated conflict. Over time, countries that had fought one another for generations increasingly chose trade, diplomacy, and shared economic development. Meanwhile, colonial empires rapidly dissolved. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, independence movements challenged European rule. New nations emerged, reshaping international politics and ending an era in which European empires dominated much of the globe. Although Europe remained economically influential, power was becoming more widely distributed. The United States emerged as a global superpower, Japan rebuilt into an industrial leader, and later countries such as South Korea, Singapore, China, and India demonstrated that rapid economic growth was not uniquely Western. Many adopted technologies, educational systems, financial institutions, and industrial methods that had evolved over centuries while adapting them to their own cultures and priorities. Today, innovation comes from every continent. Scientific discoveries are made through international collaboration. Supply chains cross oceans, financial markets operate around the clock, and ideas spread across the internet within seconds. The modern world is increasingly interconnected in ways that would have been unimaginable even a century ago. So how did Europe become so powerful? There was never a single secret. It was not simply geography, religion, culture, or luck. Europe inherited knowledge from earlier civilizations. It benefited from competition between independent states, advances in agriculture, expanding trade, universities, scientific inquiry, financial innovation, overseas exploration, industrialization, and, undeniably, the wealth extracted through colonial expansion and slavery. These forces reinforced one another over many centuries, creating conditions that allowed parts of Europe to achieve extraordinary global influence. But history also teaches another lesson. Power is never permanent. The Roman Empire once appeared invincible before it fragmented. Spain dominated global trade before its influence declined. The Dutch Republic led international finance before Britain overtook it. The British Empire governed territories across the world before decolonization transformed the international order. Even today, the balance of economic and political power continues to evolve. Perhaps the most important question, then, is not why Europe became powerful. It is why some societies continue adapting while others struggle to do so. History suggests that long-term success depends less on any single culture or geography than on a society's ability to learn, innovate, exchange ideas, build effective institutions, and respond to changing circumstances. Civilizations rise when they remain flexible, invest in knowledge, and embrace improvement. They decline when they become complacent, divided, or unable to adapt. The story of Europe's rise is therefore not a tale of destiny or superiority. It is the story of thousands of decisions made across centuries by farmers, merchants, scholars, inventors, rulers, workers, sailors, engineers, reformers, and ordinary people whose lives gradually reshaped the world. It is also a reminder that every civilization builds upon those that came before it. Knowledge travels. Technologies spread. Ideas cross borders. No great society develops entirely alone. If this documentary changed the way you think about history, let us know in the comments. What do you believe was the single most important reason for Europe's rise? Your perspective might inspire the next documentary. And if you're fascinated by the hidden forces that shaped our world, subscribe to Unknown Discoveries and join us as we uncover the stories history rarely tells. Because the greatest discoveries are often not about the past itself, but about how the past continues to shape the world we live in today.